Sociology Emerita in Dornsife College. She was educated at UCSD and Berkeley and came to USC in 1992, where she spent virtually her whole career, which is fortunate because her work has very heavily focused on Los Angeles. As she says in her website, her work is devoted to highlighting the contributions and struggles of disenfranchised and often underappreciated Latina and Latino immigrants. Within that general area, she's focused on a broad variety of topics. How, just for example, how immigrants form communities among themselves and in relation to other communities, gender and migration, religion and social movement, sociology of gardens, race and community change. She's the author of 10 books, most recently South Central Dreams in 2021 with our own Manuel Pastor, dozens of articles, conference papers, book talks, conferences organized, and she's put her research into action through community and labor organizing. Awards and honors for her work have come thick and fast throughout her career, almost every year, in fact, and multiple times within single years. And I'll just give you a couple examples. Distinguished Career Awards multiple times from various sections of the American Sociological Association. Her books have regularly won awards, 7 for her 2000 book Domestica alone, a Feminist Scholar Activist Award from the Sex and Gender section of the ASA, a Feminist Mentor Award from Sociologists for Women in Society, and a Mellon Mentoring Award for mentoring graduate students at USC. Within USC, she's won the Raubenheimer Younger Faculty Award in Dornsife College, and then the Senior Raubenheimer Faculty Award in 2019. She's also won the Phi Kappa Phi Faculty Recognition Award and a General Education Teaching Award. Her record of professional and community service, as well as service in Dornsife and at the university level, is, to say the very least, extensive. So, Pierrette, I'd like to welcome you. Pierrette will talk to us for a while about her career and her story, and then we'll have, as usual, questions and discussion. Pierrette?
Great. Well, thank you, Greg, for that really generous introduction. And most of all, thank you for organizing this whole series. That's great. You and I met, I don't know, we were in some room together in some committee years ago. So it's nice to see you here. So my nutshell introduction, Greg has kind of gone over that. I retired last year after working at USC for 30 years. I spent that time teaching undergraduate and graduate students, researching Latino immigrant life in Los Angeles, some of that time doing more community engaged research. I made a life here with Mike Messner. He's been on the faculty since 1987. He's retiring this year from gender studies and sociology. We raised 2 boys. And over the years, I had, I'm grateful. I had a lot of meaningful work with students who improved. I'm going to talk a lot about the changes that I saw in witnessed at USC over the years. But I mentored a number of PhD students as well, 16 of them. I had a number of postdoc students who came to work with me from other countries, Mexico, Sweden, Ukraine, sometimes because they wanted to work with me, sometimes because they wanted to be in LA. But among my PhD students, most of them have been first generation college students. Many of them, not all, Latina women, and most of them doing research on things that were not part of sociology until they did it. That, you know, has been really rewarding. So to talk about my intellectual journey, I'm going to break it up into 3 sections. You know, they say former Catholics can't get away from the Trinity, and I guess that's true of me. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my own family of origin and schooling, a little bit about my experiences in college and graduate school. And then I want to spend most of the time talking about my experiences at USC, describing how I have seen the student body changed, how I experienced this. And I have my own analysis of structural changes that I witnessed over my 30 years at USC. Some of us here overlap, so I'll be really curious to hear if the way I see the context of my own intellectual journey matches up with the way you might have experienced USC in the 90s or, you know, the last 20 years. So I'll start with my family of origin and schooling. I was born and raised in Redwood City, California. It's not up in the Redwoods. People often think that it's a city that's halfway between San Francisco and San Jose. It has today become, you know, part of the heart of Silicon Valley. I think Dropbox and Oracle are there. It's very glossy and shiny. But back then we called it Deadwood City. It was just a dead place to be if you were a kid or a teenager. It was not San Francisco or Haight-Ashbury. It was, but my parents were really proud of it. The city had a neon sign that said Redwood City, climate best by government test, which my father would say, like, this is like the very best possible place you could ever live. And my parents, my father is French and my mother is from Chile. They came from these big peasant families, and they went to elementary school in their countries, my mother in Chile, my father in France. So we were not a very intellectual family. We weren't even a very verbal family. Like, we spoke this kind of broken English, our own little patois. And I was not expected to go to college. In fact, we didn't know anybody who had gone away to college. And for a daughter, the only daughter, to go away, well, that was just, you know, possibly immoral. Like, how could you then kind of cover among relatives and neighbors about that? But I was stubborn. And I was very aspirational. I wanted to go to a fancy kind of liberal arts college on the East Coast, and that was never going to happen. But I did manage to get permission or somehow and allow them to let me go to UC San Diego. So, you know, we might think, well, is that a cultural deficiency? You know, well, possibly. There's a lot written about in sociology of education and inequality about cultural capital and social capital. And we can see statistically who goes on to become professors at R1 universities are, you know, very select few from particular kind of backgrounds. But I think a couple of strengths for me were that it made me better able to teach a variety of students, and especially first, you know, people who were the first generation in their families to go to high school, for instance. And then very clearly, it inspired my research. Like, I wouldn't have had ideas to do research on the kinds of things I did if I didn't have this background. So I'll explain a little bit about that. I said my mother is from Chile. Raise your hand if those of you who have been to Chile. I can see some faces. So a lot of people go to Chile now, you know, people go to see Patagonia. It's very big on the college exchange. I'm always meeting somebody who said, oh, I studied in Santiago. But back in the day, I mean, it was kind of a, you know, it's far away. It was before the era of globalization, and Chile was not yet this big neoliberal exporter of fruits and vegetables and wines. So anyways, my mother came from this big peasant family, one of 11 children. And like a lot of women in Latin America, in rural peasant Latin America of the mid 20th century, becoming a live-in domestic worker, becoming a nanny for somebody in the city was her way out of this kind of backwoods poverty and really regressive patriarchy. So she and one sister left to work. Really, they ran away from home. And there's a story about my grandfather coming with the police and a shotgun to try to get them back. But anyways, that's not the story I'm telling here. So anyways, she worked as a live-in domestic worker for many Chilean families. And then she worked for an American family. You know, Chile has all this copper, a lot of American engineers are there. And they asked, would you like to come to the United States to be our nanny? And that was her ticket here. So my first book, Gender Transitions, my dissertation book I published in 1994, is all about looking at migration as a gendered process. And I don't think I had really quite put it together with my mother's story back then, but I've really come to see her as kind of a gendered refugee. And then my second book, Domestica, which I researched here in LA, was of course inspired by her stories. Both of those were based on empirical qualitative research, sociological research I did here. My father, as I said, is from France. He's from the Pyrenees, that's in southwest France. He's from a little village called Pierrette. He is not Basque, he is Béarnais. It's kind of Basque adjacent. And he came to the Bay Area following, there was a little chain migration of people from, well, I guess Basque sheep herders had been recruited to Nevada and California. But he came after being a prisoner of war in Germany, where he was in a work camp for 5 years. So real, you know, tough guy. So he was working as a gardener and my mother as the nanny, the live-in nanny housekeeper in Woodside, which is a very Tony, horsey area, you know, kind of financial elites back in the day. Today, Silicon Valley titans like Elizabeth Holmes, she's been staying in Woodside. People like that live there. So I wound up later writing a book called Paradise Transplanted, Migration and the Making of California Gardens, which is in part about this immigrant labor suburban garden maintenance system. Later on, my father worked in construction. He became a small-time developer of houses and duplexes. And this kind of class mobility allowed me to go to Catholic school and college. So I really hated Catholic school. It was very repressive. I started in the pre-Vatican II days. It was kind of a lousy education and very, but my parents wanted discipline. But in high school, I did have some really good teachers who were inspiring. Mrs. Solari in particular. There were some nuns who were influenced by liberation theology. And, you know, I think I learned, if not how to write a paper, I learned part of how to write a paper in high school, which I don't think I would have gotten at Sequoia High School back in the day. So college and graduate school, I went to UCSD as an undergraduate, and then I got a master's at Berkeley in Latin American Studies. University of California system is phenomenal, like one of the world's great public higher educational systems. But honestly, for me as an undergraduate and a master's student, I could not find much mentorship or guidance. I was very inspired by professors, by ideas, but I don't know, I've always kind of romanticized the liberal arts college model. And I think USC kind of allowed our teaching as over the years kind of to move in that direction a bit. I graduated college at the beginning of a recession, 1979. Somebody who studied sociology and Latin American studies, you really couldn't have thought of like a worse case scenario. And I thought I might be an immigration lawyer. I worked as an immigration paralegal, found that wasn't for me. I worked as a bilingual secretary in schools. I thought I might become a bilingual teacher, but academia, well, sociology and history were just plain old more interesting. So I went to Berkeley in Latin American studies and ultimately into the PhD program in sociology, although realizing, well, these have really risky, uncertain occupational futures. I think it's worse today, but already it was it seemed very dicey back then. And, you know, I wanted to work as a professor. I wasn't just going to get, it wasn't just like my finishing school PhD. So at Berkeley in sociology, I had an amazing dissertation mentor. His name is Michael Buravoy. And later this month, I'm going to go to Berkeley to celebrate his retirement, which is amazing because I thought he was really old. It turns out he's only 9 years older than me. But when you're a graduate student, like professor seems so much older. But anyways, he was very, very generous for me after all these years in the UC system where nobody had really given me constructive feedback, guidance. So he was tough, very intellectually rigorous, and I still feel so grateful for all of that. But back then, and I was in graduate school in the 80s, there was not a lot of focus or any focus on what we would today call professionalization. Berkeley, sociology's top program in the field, was very intellectual, it was very political, but there was not a lot of focus on what would come next or how you would get to that next stage. So over the years with my PhD students here at USC, I started at some point telling them, you really should strive to have 3 publications by the time you graduate. You know, publish your MA or empirical paper, try to co-author something with me or another professor, and 1 chapter of your dissertation, because it's so competitive out there. And now we've seen even a sea change where people are sometimes have publications or they've gone to conferences before even starting graduate school. But it was not like that in the 80s, or at least in Berkeley, at Berkeley sociology. Like nobody said you should go to conferences or do that kind of thing. And in fact, careerist was a bad word for us. Like, and here was my contradiction. I wanted a career, but I didn't want to seem careerist. That would be a bad thing, right? So I met Mike Messner at, as graduate students in Berkeley. He started at USC in 1987, hired in gender studies, and then a joint appointment with sociology. And so I followed him here in 88 after I had finished my field work, which I did in Redwood City, actually. And I wrote my dissertation in our garage office in Atwater Village. I became a freeway flyer because I thought this was going to help me with my career. And I was pregnant, which means I was sleepy. And on Tuesdays and Thursdays, I drove to a community college in Orange County. And Monday, Wednesdays, I went to Cal State San Bernardino, which seemed like going to another state. But I thought, well, I'm doing it again, making my lectures. We had our first baby in 1989. And then I got a writing fellowship at UC San Diego. We were able to go there when our son Miles was 4 months old, and Mike had that junior leave. You know, USC gives you a junior leave. You're supposed to be working hard on your tenure, but we had a colicky baby, and he was pretty much holding the baby while I was trying to write this dissertation. Technology was very low level. I remember to print out my dissertation, for some reason, we drove all the way back to USC and we used the printer in gender studies. It seems crazy now. Anyways, my good fortune was Dean Sylvester Whitaker, an African-American political scientist who had studied development in Africa. He was a dean at USC. Well, I mentioned I got the writing fellowship, but then I got a book contract with UC Press. And Dean Whitaker wanted to retain Mike. He saw something in me that would actually help build the center he had called the Center for Multi-Ethnic and Transnational Studies. So he hired me. I think he's now passed away, but I'm so grateful. And up until then, I did all of my tenure track job really at USC, but I did have a one-year tenure track appointment at Cal State San Bernardino. By that point, I had a 1-year-old. I was driving to San Bernardino. And when I came to USC, our interim chair, who really was just the nicest person, just like the nicest person who was ever in our department, told me I could not start my tenure clock anew. That was wrong. But he said, no, once you've started it elsewhere. So I deferred starting till January of I think 94 because I wanted the tenure clock to start then. And actually, point of interest, I took a pay cut to come to USC. So it's kind of interesting. The more working class Cal State San Bernardino paid me a higher salary. So these were pretty exhausting and kind of exhilarating years. I guess we had a lot of energy back then. Okay, USC, this is mostly what I want to talk about. I think you'd be hard pressed. I know, Eleanor, you came from Berkeley too. I think you'd be hard pressed to find two campuses with more different campus cultures than USC and UC Berkeley. In the early 90s, when I arrived at USC, it was really primarily an educational site for educating regional business elites and professionals. The professional schools were well known. And it was attended by many, not all, but many privileged students whose families could afford the high tuition. And once we got here, we heard these derogatory names for USC, the acronym standing for University of Spoiled Children or the University of Second Choice. And to be honest, I was thrown in to teach these big lecture classes and various other, our classes, even our basic upper division were bigger back then. And undergraduate admission was not very selective. Yeah, there were a few good students, but there were many who were just ill-prepared, I would say, for college. And the campus culture that I encountered at USC in the early 90s was really characterized by this outsized importance on football, high visibility of sorority and fraternity members dressed alike in the beginning of the fall semester, kind of a clubby branding. Students would wear those the USC baseball caps backwards in the lecture halls. and this, illusion of we all belong to a Trojan family. So it seemed really exclusionary and honestly kind of anachronistic to walk in to that. But USC changed over those 30 years, mostly for the better. And I think there are two defining strands. And here's where I really want to shift to talking about what I understand is the changing structural context of USC, especially happening in the 90s and the 2000s. And that's neoliberalism and affirmative action, or what we might call diversity, equity, and inclusion programs today. So I was actually hired by in 91. I started in 92. I'm getting my dates mixed up, but Stephen Sample had just started as president, and he led these two big strategic fundraising campaigns, ultimately raising about $3 billion. And I remember walking in here, and there was such a barrage of kind of propaganda about the fundraising campaigns. And I was honestly cynical about it. I would just kind of roll my eyes. I thought, oh, sure. But then the money would be raised faster than they had expected. The targets had been maxed and they would just raise it. And they were being elevated to new heights. So, we all have lived and worked in Los Angeles. We know a lot of money circulates in a global city, metropolitan area like Los Angeles, with an economy like California. And USC relied on these ties to raise a lot of money. So my first 20 years at USC was I experienced massive buildings just dropping from the sky. It was this huge construction zone. The Annenberg wasn't there, the Galen Center, the cinema school. I mean, it just the whole, do we call it the sample, where the restaurant courts with the fountains, all of that, was a result of this. These USC capital fundraising campaigns and the university really seemed to me to be governed by a very hierarchical, top-down administrative system. And from the president, the provost, and the deans, we heard a lot of aspirational proclamations that we were now world-class. We were better than UCLA. UCLA is no longer the competition, Dean of Dornsife once said. Now, the money was not really flowing into sociology, I will say. In fact, I've already told you I was hired at a lower salary. I was told at that time, don't worry, we'll make up for it next year. But then I guess there was a recession and everybody's salaries were frozen for a few years. And in fact, we were told in the office to really watch it with Xeroxing, mailing, and phones. We all had phones in our offices, no, long distance phone calls. But the money, also we had a very stern office manager who was kind of scary. Anyway, another side story there. But ultimately, the money did transform USC. And I believe it did transform and improve the opportunities for sociology graduate students and mentoring. So there really was a sea change. As I've already suggested, I see USC's big transformation in the 90s and in the early 2000s as the outcome of this neoliberal model of growth. What is neoliberalism? It's one of these words that gets, thrown around in our classrooms. Our students write it down. They don't really know what it is. So, you know, just my own understanding is it's really a logic, a model, an ideology of a kind of market-based growth and expansion. It's a particular phase of capitalism that's affiliated with loosening government regulations, global expansion, and a sense of competitive entrepreneurialism. And entrepreneurialism would come to be a very important kind of branding label for USC. Neoliberalism is also associated with an emphasis on quantifiable metrics, more time and energy spent on assessment and monitoring. That's part of the strategy of neoliberalism. So at USC, this manifested itself not only through fundraising, but also with heightened importance on student selectivity and then publicizing student selectivity, more importance on faculty productivity, rising standards for tenure, which I lived in fear of for many years. And then I saw many really well-deserved colleagues in sociology and in Dornsife. Not all, but a lot of them women, many of them faculty of color who were denied tenure during this kind of new arms race. Neoliberalism is also associated with a focus. We can think of the focus on student evaluations, seeing students as customers, building, you know, this was happening at other universities also, right? Building the climbing walls. Like, remember, like, no student could go to a college that didn't have a climbing wall and some excellent gym. We can think of the, what do they call it? They called it the Hogswarts building, the big, I forget what it's called. The cultivation of international students, especially from China and India and Korea, as key sources of tuition revenue, but also as future sources of university philanthropy. USC has, you know, invested in getting new philanthropic spigots in Asia. So what are the outcomes? I think students, faculty, research did improve during this period at USC, this period of neoliberal growth, but it's also my personal opinion, my belief that the spectacular scandals that we have witnessed at USC in recent years are also the direct outgrowth of this model. And I had to kind of write down the scandals because I have trouble keeping track of them, but we can think of the Varsity Blues graft and scandal over admissions, the dope sick medical school dean that went on for so long, the cover-up of the gynecologist and the sexual assaults in student medical services that eventually led to the settlement of $1.1 billion. The School of Social Work payolas, Rossier's School of Education's lying about admissions data to get higher rankings. I think all of those are direct outgrowths of this neoliberal business model. Before we open it up for questions, I want to say a few things about affirmative action and DEI and the racial politics, the location of Los Angeles and how that's shaped what we do at USC. Policies stemming from the civil rights movement in the 60s led to the momentary institutionalization of affirmative action, to the development of DEI policies, to programs like Mellon Mays, to the now defunct Ford Fellows, but that, you know, very transformative. DEI policies in many different units. And we can think of the 1992 rebellions as part of this as well. That was honestly my first semester teaching at USC. I woke up one day in Atwater Village, listening to the news, but I thought, oh, I'm just going to go teach my classes. I was going to talk to a reporter from the New York Times. It was going to be a big deal. And then, oh, we got the message we shouldn't come. No, the city burned to the ground. People were so angry with racial inequality and class inequality. They burned the city to the ground. But in the aftermath of that, there's a whole new group of NGOs, community coalitions, programs that kind of came out of the ashes, and USC was part of that. President Sample made that announcement. We're not going to Pepperdine. We're staying here. Neighborhood Academic Initiative came online and grew, cultivated students from the 5 local schools who turned out then to be some of my students in my freshman class last year, for example. The Center for Religion and Civic Culture, headed up by Don Miller for many years, in which I participated in when I did research on religion and religious social movements for immigrant rights, partnered so importantly with a lot of neighbors. And then, I mentioned that I mentored many amazing PhD students, many of them first generation Latinx students who are now faculty elsewhere and authors of their own award-winning books. They were not part of the graduate cohorts when I entered USC. In fact, our cohorts were very large. They were mostly unfunded, and they were like free-floating agents looking for professors. So anyways, I will end on a positive note, and that is, I'll just tell you that last spring when I taught my final semester, I taught an upper division sociology class, and I taught a GE class, what was called that GE seminar. I think I had 17 or 18 students, and the students now are so smart. The freshman students, they're not sociology majors. I know they're going to business and engineering and elsewhere, but they're really diverse. They're still as one colleague called them, the Pasadena kids, students from coastal areas, but they're well prepared for college. They're engaged. They're actually curious. They may not know a lot about history or social issues, but they seem to want to learn. The students who came through Neighborhood Academic Initiative, a program that starts in 6th grade, are now on campus and are part of the mix in our classrooms. And then I think these new, these cosmopolitan international students really had a lot. So all of them just so much better than the students I had in the early 90s. And Mike Mester and I have talked about this a lot too, and that is the process of aging, which of course we have aged in the classroom. Our students stay the same. Actually, they seem younger and younger. But I think age really softened us with students, made us more empathetic to them. And maybe they became more respectful to us as old professors in a way that they weren't back in the day. I guess that's it. I'll open it up for comments. Yes, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pierrette. That's fascinating, and sure takes me back too. So do people have questions or comments or bring up anything for discussion? Eleanor?
Well, thank you, Pierrette. That was very interesting. And I appreciated your autobiographical summary, integrating your family life with your research topics and your inspiration to go to graduate school, et cetera. And I also very much appreciated your summary of the history of USC in the past, in the 30 years that you were there. And it all makes, I mean, it agrees with my memory of everything that went on and the amazing things that President Sample did. I mean, I answered a question once about why USC has changed so dramatically in the last, well, 40 years, really. And I really attribute it to President Sample. And your analysis of the neoliberalism is very interesting too, because of course this does go across the country, and it's not just USC, but USC really has made great strides. And yes, I was prepared to come to USC from Berkeley because I had taught at 2 small liberal arts colleges prior to that, where the quality of the students was not the same as at Berkeley. And so that was my trial by fire before coming to USC. But so it's what you said in all 3 parts of your presentation has been very provocative or thought-provoking. And one question I wanted to ask you from the beginning, I mean, I've admired you from a distance. You know, we've known about each other and we're acquaintances. But I've never got to know you very well, and I've always admired you tremendously for all your accomplishments from a distance. And one of my questions, because I know it was a struggle for me, is how you manage work-life balance, especially as a mother of 2 children. And my imagination is that it was probably easier with a husband who's also an academic, because both your schedules are somewhat more flexible and you can coordinate leaves and so forth. But I think it's a question that came up as women pursued careers from the 1960s, 1970s on, but it's still a problem and an unresolved problem. And so what wisdom might you share with younger people who might see this recording or graduate students that you've mentored?
Oh gosh, that's such a good question, Eleanor. Thank you for your comment. You know, I wish we had spent time together too, but there was no time to just hang out. I mean, it seems like, oh, you're on campus, you're going to have lunch or coffee with this person, but no, I was, you know, we're in our offices doing something or, you know, running around, but maybe there's still time for us. But well, this is such a good question. I can begin by telling you, I already told you, you know, I was a freeway flyer with my first child, who was born in '89, and in my second year at USC, spring of '93, I had a placental abruption while teaching a class. So this is to say, I had no maternity leave. We had a feminist dean. We had a sympathetic office staff and chair, but there were no structural policies in place to allow, you know, today it's a sea change. It's changed a bit in that respect. In fact, I'll announce that as of this morning, I'm a grand aunt. My niece just had a baby at 4:25 this morning, and her partner, they're not married, but he has a job as installing industrial garage doors, like a very scary industrial job, but he's going to have 6 weeks of paternity leave at 80% pay. It's pretty good. You know, it's not Sweden, but it's pretty good for California. But back in the day, that did not exist in California, and it did not exist at USC. However, we did have a wonderful angel in our midst, a rabble rouser, and that was Barry Thorne. So Barry Thorne was our senior colleague in sociology and gender studies, a great role model and mentor for Mike and I, and she was really devoting herself to changing policy and political culture at USC. Like, she would come into a faculty meeting and she would say, why are we all sitting in desks like this, facing the chair? We're going to sit in a circle instead. And she, together with others, pushed for somebody in the law school, I can't remember now, but they pushed for USC's first family leave program. And that meant by the following year, when I had a 1-year-old and I was no longer pregnant, no longer on with placental abruption or in bed rest, USC had family leave. And I will tell you, I had 2 male colleagues who had stay-at-home wives who were not in the workforce, and they both got, I think, a full semester off. They got paternity leave. So USC, if you're listening and you want to give me retroactive family leave, I would take it. So the policies have changed a bit. I did get my tenure clock stopped 1 year. I considered that a big feat. Eleanor, if I was giving advice to somebody today, I would say make more noise, push harder. I think I felt, oh, assistant professor, I'm just happy to be here. Let me just, maybe nobody will notice I'm pregnant. And I know I was not the only one in that situation. Right, the idea of keeping that part of your life separate, lest you look less dedicated, less professional. Yeah, being married to another academic helped, but probably, being married to a man who's, concertedly pro-feminist man who's made a career out of that, made it, helped a little more. We always taught on different days. We taught, one of us would teach Tuesday, Thursday, the other would be Monday, Wednesday. For some reason, our department always had the faculty meetings then at 2 p.m. on Friday, like the least family-friendly time. I don't really know what, I guess we found somebody to take our kids, memories a little hazy. We could not afford to go to professional conferences at the same time because of childcare. So I think, wow, today our graduate students go to conference, they start going to ASA right off the bat. I didn't go till I was an assistant professor, and then we couldn't afford it. USC also gave a very small per diem back then. And we had childcare issues. So we alternated. We went every other year. Yesterday, I was talking with Vicky Ruiz, who I'm sure you know, Eleanor, the very well-known feminist Chicana historian. And she told me at UCI now, they have policies that will support your childcare expenses when you go to a conference. Wow. So I think a lot of us, we just thought, oh, we're grateful to be here. We should have pushed for more. So that's what I would say to young people, push for more.
Good. Do others have, especially those of you whose pictures, whose videos are blank, jump in. I mean, don't hesitate and don't be shy.
This is Sandra Ball-Roquette. I have an observation and a question for Pierrette. Thank you so much for your presentation. I found it fascinating, and so much of it resonated with my experiences of the changes at USC. But I came to USC in 1986 and stayed until retirement in 2022. And, or was it 21? But a couple of observations. I came as a full professor, and I came from state institutions prior to that. But as soon as I walked into the original Annenberg School for Communication building, I thought, oh my God, I'm entering corporate headquarters. I mean, it was so plush. And I had a secretary.
Wow.
There were one secretary per 2 faculty, you know, I mean, it was just, and I felt so bad for the college. Because I knew, being a sociologist and periodically being on some committees with Mike, for example, with sociology graduate students, I knew just how awful the situation was in the college. And I think you're correct in looking at some of the structural factors in terms of endowment. But I wonder, I know that you complimented Steve Sample a great deal, but my observation was that that happened also through Lloyd Armstrong.
Yeah.
Is that your recall?
Yeah, he was provost. You know, I've never been in upper administration. I made a decision early on. I tried not to be a slacker. I think I was on a lot of committees, but I knew I never aspired to be in upper administration. So I was, you know, if I wasn't privy to those discussions. I'm sure you're right. You're right. Yeah.
Well, I do think that he came out of physics rather than engineering, and I think that makes a big difference, actually. And I think he was absolutely dedicated to upgrading the undergraduate institution at USC. And I was very fortunate. At the Annenberg School, we had tremendous students from the start. So your being able to fight through to your accomplishments, which I've admired over the years, meant that you had a much harder struggle than I did. Although I did have some trouble with the athletics department. A dean called me up because I flunked a first string black basketball player who was African American. And the reason I flunked him was he never came to class. And that dean called me up and said I was not a loyal Trojan. And that really, really upset me. And I said, well, I guess I'm not, because I think you're doing harm to this student. So I talked to the student and I said, you know, you're being used. And I can't give you a grade when you never came to class. And he said, I know. I said, but look, I'm on a committee looking into the athletics department. And one of the big things I'll be looking for is tutoring of students and upgrading the tutoring, not just the exercise equipment. So that's just a little story.
Yeah. Well, I mean, that's just the other structural feature, football being such a big part of the college's, of the university's identity, and using players like industrial workers,
Yes.
and then expecting them to go to class. Yeah. But Sandra, I like one other, I kind of want to swing back to one other point you made, which is about the kind of internal inequality in the schools at USC, so accentuated back then, and I suppose so now as well. Like,
Yeah.
But I think a big question on everybody's mind, or big issue, is just the inequality in higher ed today, right, between the Ivies, the next tier, a very selective competitive, well-endowed, well-funded universities, and then the smaller colleges going belly up, and then the advent of tech ed. So I don't know if anybody read the article that was just in the Chronicle of Higher Education written. It's kind of covering the book that was written by the president of Temple University, who's just stepped down, promoting a real business model of tech ed, which I think, it's happening many places at USC, but I think the MA in social work and the MA in education are two of the big examples. And what do people think? What is USC's strategy now? It seems to me like USC wants to do both. It wants to have the selective college, and then it wants to have also the tech revenue generating master's degrees.
That's certainly true in the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism, with increasing focus on the MA degree as an income provider to the school. And I think it really takes away from the resources of the faculty who want to go out there and do grounded research in the communities of Los Angeles, as you have done.
Yeah, well, yeah.
Any other takers for Pierrette's question?
I'd like to make a quick comment if I could, since my name was invoked so many times here. Yeah, it's nice to see you all. But I did want to, it's just a comment that this very night, USC is going to hang a big medallion around Pierrette's neck. She's giving me Lifetime Achievement Award at USC tonight. And I'm really proud of that for her, but also you're talking about sort of how USC has changed over time. And this is one indicator, I think, of change over time. And she's obviously fully deserving of this honor. But my thinking is that 20 years ago, 25 years ago, somebody with Pierrette's profile would not have been considered as somebody who would even be eligible for consideration for lifetime achievement. I think there's an award that mostly goes to the big guys, and the people who bring in gazillions of dollars to the university. And Pierrette has brought in almost no money, very modest amounts, right, to the university, but brings in a lot of prestige and because of her work and because of her mentoring and her great graduate students from all over the place and these really great universities. So anyway, I just wanted to share that with you in case you didn't know it, that this is Lifetime Achievement Award winner here.
And I would like to speak up too, because I will be with you tonight. I will be with you tonight to celebrate, and I also coordinate that that particular award. And Pierrette was like way up high, with the rankings and stuff. I think you just shot a lot of people out of the park, Pierrette. So couldn't be prouder to just be there, just to celebrate and clap for you. It's a big honor, and at the Academic Honors Convocation. And I believe, Jerry, you're going to be there tonight too as well, right? You're going to have to fix your
Dad, your sound
like Mickey Mouse again. Sorry about that.
Oh, is my sound all messed up?
No, you're better now, Dad.
Fine.
Thank you. I need a daughter to remind me of that. But Laura and I will be there cheering you on, Pierrette. And in the bad old days before you came to USC, some of us were struggling to try and make the place better. And I created the Academic Honors Convocation in 1981.
Wow.
So I love attending these, and I'm so pleased you're being honored. May I ask a question about the evolution of your department? Even though you were underfunded as a department for many years, how have you perhaps influenced the appointments of new faculty and modification of the balance of subdisciplines in sociology?
Yeah, thanks, Jerry. That's a good question. Well, it's a collective process. When I came into the Department of Sociology, it was a totally different department. And some people called us a niche or a boutique department. And that's kind of an insult to say you're a boutique department. It means you don't cover very much. And there were really three groups. There were the demographers, they had a pop lab, and it was really David Hare and Dawn Van Arsdale. They had a pop lab, which was located off campus. And they brought in a lot of graduate students from the Southern Hemisphere who were really coming. Many of them civil servants. They were learning, I don't know, measuring fertility control, things like that. And then they went back to their countries to do demography, usually in a civil servant government capacity. So they didn't seem to be training people for graduate education, to go for academic jobs. Then we had quite a few criminologists, Marcus Felsen, Matt Klein, and others. And maybe a couple of their students went to academic jobs. I'm not really sure. And then a couple of people, we had this a sort of odd track where we were training people to become family therapists, usually like for the county or the VA. They would get a PhD in sociology and MFCC. And I will say there we got some of really excellent students. Like my first student, Gloria Gonzalez Lopez, is now an endowed chair at UT Austin. So sometimes students would come over, and Blanca Ramirez from our department is going to be starting a job at UT Austin this year. So I think over the years, each chair, each regime was a little different. There were moments where we kind of grew qualitative sociology. I think we never had a gender hire. Is that correct, Mike? But people did come in and doing more gender. And then number of people doing Latino sociology, urban, immigration. I think that has really grown to be a pretty nice, healthy, and diverse section in our department. So departmental strengths of sociology became broader, and I think maybe deeper in academia. And I will say there was this one change, and people here, like I bet you Anne and Eleanor will remember in the college when we used to have very large first-year graduate cohorts, and then there was kind of an overnight rule, we're going to shrink the cohorts, and they were going to be funded for 5 years. And I remember thinking, oh, this is going to be terrible. They're closing us down. But actually, to the contrary, the quality of our graduate students went up, and they were funded, not funded like what you really need to live in LA, perhaps. But that was a great change. And I cannot honestly remember what year that was. I want to go back and figure that out. But those were big changes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, speaking of Lloyd Armstrong, that was under Lloyd Armstrong, and it was in the 90s that happened. But it made USC a real, it was already a research university, but it just transformed graduate education in the college and really raised the status of the departments within the college. So nothing could have been more important than that, I think. And then they also had the initiative, for better or worse, of hiring senior faculty in economics, English, and history. Mm-hmm. I think those were the three. I mean, I know history and English were two of the departments, but I think economics was the other one. Mm-hmm. So there was real, to echo what Sandra said, that Armstrong really put in. I mean, he met with faculty in the college and became convinced, because at that point, Sample kept hearing complaints from parents about TAs that couldn't speak English. And I was in a meeting with faculty from across the college, along with Sample, and I think Armstrong may have been there, but it was faculty really convincing both of them, and Sample allowing Armstrong to take this initiative to build up the college and certain departments within it. That, you know, they really did listen to the faculty. And we also got, after that, we had research grants every year. I mean, they were small, but they allowed us to go to conferences at least once a year, and individual faculty could get more, but it just, it was a huge change.
Yeah, thank you for that, Eleanor. So would you agree with the statement that up until that moment, really the college was seen as sort of a secondary stepchild?
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
absolutely.
Yeah, I think if I could step in, I think Lloyd Armstrong had a huge amount to do with that. He had been dean of the college at Hopkins, in fact, and so he came with that sort of liberal arts background. And at first, Sample was really a fan of the professional schools and wanted to see the college as a sort of undergraduate place. And I was actually in his meeting with department chairs, college department chairs, in which he suggested that all graduate programs in the college should be eliminated.
I was there too. Yeah.
Yeah, you were.
That's what I was talking about. That's what I was talking about. That meeting.
And I was in another meeting with him after that, where we were all trying to deal with this huge explosion. And he said, well, I had dinner with the president of Pomona College the other night. Why can't the college be like that? And we all said, we really need graduate programs. And it was Lloyd, I think, who convinced him that the college should be central. Mm-hmm. And this was a huge process. And I will give Sample all the credit for being a big enough person to change his mind. Mm-hmm. And that is the other part of that was that in the early 90s, there was what led to that suggestion of his, this huge draining of the college budget. And we were in an enormous financial crisis because general education, which had been taught in the college mainly, had migrated out to professional schools. And under Lloyd, the GE program was completely revised in a way that Sample liked, and put back mainly in the college. And and again, the argument was, this is where the college is really the liberal arts part, and students should be in that. Now that was kind of a controversial thing, and of course the trend now is in the other direction. Yeah. But at the time, it made a huge difference, and and I think that was a large part of the increase in quality too, in the faculty and in the students, at least in the college. But I had the same feeling as Pierrette, and I'm sure Eleanor and Anne and everybody, that the quality of the students, the quality of the undergraduates and graduate students just kept skyrocketing every year. It was exciting after a while to teach at USC, where it had not been so exciting before. And I think that was those were a really wonderful set of developments, though I agree with you completely about the role of neoliberalism and neoliberal thinking in in all of this. And I think we've seen, as you've sort of implied, Pierrette, the strengths of that and the weaknesses. And USC has experienced both. So other comments, questions, discussion? No? Well, yeah. Oh, I didn't even realize the time. Pierrette, I just want to thank you again. This was exactly the kind of talk we had in mind for this program. It's really been a fascinating talk and really fascinating to hear about, as Eleanor said, your combination of your family background and your professional development and intellectual development. So thank you very much.
Oh, well, thank you, Greg and Jeanette, for organizing all of this. And I really like this discussion too. Like, my memory gets hazy, so I really appreciate people kind of filling in, and it's kind of coming back to me. Oh yeah, there was the senior faculty hiring and the GE, all of these different restructuring components. I'll tell you just on this thing about students, Mike is teaching his final classes now. Every time he comes home, he's like, you won't believe what like somebody said. And last year for a moment, I did think, wait a minute, why am I retiring? But I did. And thank you for this. Appreciate it.
Thank
Yeah.
you.
Yeah.
And thanks to everyone for attending remotely. And we'll see you at future sessions, I hope.
Great.
Yes.